All right, Matthew Schultz, Executive Chairman at CleanSpark. I am excited to have you on the show and dive into some energy-related conversation. For people listening and myself, maybe kick it off with a little background on yourself and what CleanSpark is attempting to do in the world.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Mike. It's great to meet you. We're a little bit of an anomaly. We really came out of the energy and microgrid space, and that's kind of our core DNA. We designed software that enabled the deployment of multiple different types of energy generation assets. So solar, fuel cells, turbines, whatever the case may be, and integrated those into a single software-defined ecosystem. And we've deployed systems for the Marines and commercial, industrial, all different types of enterprises that were, traditionally high energy users with a lot of inefficiencies. And about 2 years ago, let me stop there for a second. I guess January of 2018, we designed a microgrid system for a digital currency company. They were looking for ways to get resiliency, to lower some of their costs and add renewables. And so we designed a system back in January of 2018. And since then, we've kind of had a bit of an affinity for the space, just understanding what digital currency and decentralized currency and decentralized energy have in common. So a couple of years ago, we were designing a system for a facility in Atlanta, and running the numbers and looking at the economics, it just made sense. We acquired that facility and have been scaling up and adding facilities and mining equipment ever since.
So just to wrap my head around when you say you go in and install, the company is responsible for designing like hardware, servers, cooling systems. Am I generally right? What are the kind of core domains of what you're doing there?
Yeah. Okay. So I apologize. That was a little bit, I took a tangent there. So okay. I'll give you an example at the Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. There were 55 unique energy vendors that were already located on site. So you had different manufacturers of solar panels and inverters, chargers, energy storage systems, generators, turbines, etc. And they all worked independently. But the challenge was that the California Energy Commission, together with the Department of Energy, put together a grant to create a system that could operate disconnected from the grid. So CleanSpark proposed an RFP on that, or to that RFP, and our solution was different from the General Electric, ABB, Siemens, Schneider of the world. What we did is, rather than their thesis of remove and replace that old equipment, just put a single line manufacturer and then we can manage an energy system, we approached it from a software perspective that was both vendor and hardware agnostic. So it enabled us to use all of that legacy infrastructure into a software-defined ecosystem to provide resiliency and efficiency. And what we did is we designed the software system that controls that. So the way that we reach the conclusions about what our software does is through another tool that we built, a modeling tool that we now sell as a kind of a SaaS-based solution that enables us to model energy storage depending on the geographic location and what the dependency is on solar or wind or other renewables, time of use charges, etc. And we help to design and engineer and work with the boots on the ground kind of guys that are going to put out the solar panels and the generators, etc. So our solution is more tech. It's engineering, software, and controls, and we have a multitude of patents kind of surrounding that offering.
Okay, and generally speaking, you guys have been around for a while, so I imagine there's been a transition in how energy looks over the last. You started in 2007, if my notes are correct. So 14 years. Can you give me a scope of, and correct me if I'm wrong there, but can you give me a scope also of where the company is in terms of size, either revenue or employees or
Yeah,
some kind of indication?
So it's kind of been an evolutionary process. We started out with a portfolio of patents that surrounded the conversion of feedstock that was carbon based. So coal or municipal waste or whatever the feedstock may be, and converting that into a clean syngas that can then be used to generate electricity or convert to liquid fuels. It was two of us, and we worked with a number of research universities to build, develop, deploy, test, and then get white papers complete on that technology. And that's what led us into joint venturing with microgrids. So we went from a company of 2 pre-revenue to we're over 80 employees now. We did $10 million in gross revenue last year. Our fiscal year ended September 30th, and the most recent public guidance we gave was between 470 and 600% year over year growth. A lot of that fed by obviously our entry into the digital currency space. So we've gone from a $10 million company to a $50 million company, from 2 employees to well over 80, and for a brief period of time this year, we crested $1 billion in market valuation as a NASDAQ company. So it's a bit kind of paralleling the Russell 2000 and the digital currency space, but it's been on a nice run lately.
And do you feel like the trajectory is to just double down entirely on digital currency, crypto?
Yeah. So I think that the confusion is, and there are some other big miners in the space, the Marathon, Riot of the world, that are really brute force. Just buy miners and plug them in wherever you can, co-locate facilities, whatever. CleanSpark has had a little bit of a different approach in that we've acquired our own facilities. We've strategically created power purchase agreements that not only give us advantageous pricing for digital currency mining, but also enable us to overlay microgrids to further reduce the cost of energy. Beyond that, those PPAs are longer term with smaller utilities in some instances that enable the utilities to make larger commitments about adding renewables for the benefit of the entire community, because they have a strong offtake agreement with a company like CleanSpark. So, we're uniquely balanced in that everything about digital currency mining really comes down to energy. And as an energy company at our core, we have an understanding that it really comes down to how you purchase power and what the sources and uses of that power are. So it's a bit of a different approach. We are very bullish on Bitcoin, but also bullish on what it means for the planet as a mechanism to incentivize investment in energy infrastructure to prevent situations like we've seen in California and in Texas and in other places, by incentivizing those utilities to make investments to clean up the energy mix, to improve the power quality, and to actually look at a decentralized kind of distributed approach to energy management.
Interesting. A couple points of clarification. What is a PPA, and how do you define a microgrid?
I appreciate that clarification. PPA is power purchase agreement. So I'll give you an example. We work with a regional wholesale network at one of our facilities in Georgia. We created that relationship because it's 90+% non-carbon emitting power. A percentage of that is derived from what they call peaker plants, or coal-fired power plants that come on in instances of peak demand. And by making a sizable commitment financially to that wholesale network, they've committed to us to offset those peaker plants with solar to replace that for the benefit of the entire area. I can tell you that within the next several months, we'll be the largest customer of that utility. We're currently the second largest, behind only the Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. So we actually passed Coca-Cola in size from an energy consumption perspective. A microgrid is a decentralized group of energy generating assets. So if you think of the macro grid, you've got the power plants that create the power, you got the transmission lines and the substations. That's the macro grid. So a microgrid would be the same thing, only on a smaller scale. So we've done those for campuses, for buildings, for shopping centers, for big box retailers. We've created solutions where we enable them to utilize renewables and couple that with other existing resources, be that their backup generator system or energy storage, and allow them to buy energy from the utility when the terms are favorable, and to store the renewable energy for deployment later in the day when the time of use charges may go up, or when renewables aren't as valuable. You know, the sun goes down, you can only have solar so much time. So the time of use charge that the utilities charge for solar or for electricity is lower during the day. So if you buy that cheap power and you operate the facility using cheap electricity, and then you're using your solar to recharge your energy storage, kind of gives you the benefit of being able to deploy that later when economic conditions dictate, or in the event of a disruption, you've got resilient power so the lights stay on. Kind of a unique little story. We work with H-E-B grocers throughout Texas. And when the hurricane came through Houston, a lot of the backup generators at even some of the EMS facilities, police and fire, they were submerged by the water. So you've got diesel generators that are underwater, so they don't function. So we have pictures in one of our facilities of EMS personnel staging in the stock room of an H-E-B grocery store because it was running on a microgrid. So it provides that resiliency, that energy certainty. We do a lot of work in California with people that qualify for benefits, their rebates through the California Energy Commission. They have what's called a self-generation incentive program that enables people that are in a fire-prone or disaster-prone area that may have other extenuating circumstances that require that they have consistent power, medical conditions, or whatever the case may be. And we enable them to deploy solar plus energy storage so they've got resiliency to power medical devices or whatever the case may be.
Super interesting. Do you feel, first question is a short one, I think. When the utility company sets the rate for the power at a certain time, how is that tracked? So picture a community of 1,000 homes. The prices go up for everyone. It's the same price. Does that track nowadays at the home? There's a meter that is updated and knows how much the cost of energy is. It knows how much you're using, and it's keeping track of that. I remember when I was a kid, people would come to the house and they would read your meter. And I'm curious what the state is now, how that's sort of being done and being tracked.
Yeah, it really depends on the jurisdiction. A lot of states still do that. So the Public Utility Commission requires that the utilities publish those rates. So what's happened is over the last decade, obviously solar has had a tremendous run. You've got all these rooftop solar installers, and what that's done is that's carved into the profits of the utilities. And so the Public Utility Commission requires that they can only charge a specified amount of power in a 24-hour cycle. So what they've done is they modify and they shift that time of use charge. What happened is back in September of last year, September 17th of 2020, there was a piece of legislation passed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Committee. It's FERC 2222, and it basically said that if you have renewable generation over 1 megawatt, then the utilities are required as a matter of public policy to buy that power back from you at the posted rate. So because solar is becoming so prevalent, what the utilities have done is they've kind of shifted those time of use charges. So energy during the day is cheaper. So if they're buying surplus power back from you, they're paying you a lower amount. So they have time of use charges, and those can change in 15-minute intervals. So the old school way of reading the meter still exists. What our approach has been is to have our software that monitors both the demand from the facility or the home or the campus, as well as the time of use charges, and pairs that with the renewables to make sure that we avoid those peaks. Many people are unaware that if you owned a manufacturing facility with multiple pieces of equipment, and during one 15-minute interval in a month, all of those pieces of equipment started simultaneously, just as a fluke. You turned them all on at once. That would create a demand in the energy charge. And once you pass into those peak demand charges, the utility's argument is, well, we agreed to sell Mike power, and Mike buys this much power, but on this instance, for 15 minutes, he bought more power. Now, because me, Mr. Generous Public Utility, I don't know when that 15-minute interval was. I had to have that power available. So it's okay for me to charge a retroactive peak demand for the entire billing cycle. So if you're operating your business and energy is a big factor, and you have a single isolated incident of peak demand, it can really wreck your financials for the entire billing period. So we approach it proactively. We do day ahead forecasting. Incorporated in kind of our approach is a modeling solution that includes an NOAA input. So we can, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. So it does day ahead forecasting. So if you got a lot of solar or a lot of wind, we incorporate that into the behavior. And our controller is cloud-based. So there's a component of AI. So it monitors the behaviors of the end user, and it changes the operation of the system to meet the behavior of the end user. So if there's an increase in demand or an increase in utility charges, it'll change the behavior as far as how much energy it stores and when it deploys to maximize the efficiency, whether we're looking to avoid costs, create resiliency so the lights stay on no matter what, or in some instances, like in campuses, the main focus of the system is to avoid greenhouse gas emissions. So we model around those vectors, and the controller makes the decisions based on that modeling solution.
Interesting. So in the case of blackouts would happen when the demand is too high for the grid, and that just crashes the whole thing.
So there's a number of reasons that blackouts are caused. Most recently, what we're seeing, and you hear it the most about in California, is as a result of wildfires. So the utilities have settled many lawsuits because of the infrastructure causing a fire. So once fires start, in order to be proactive and kind of preempt any liability, the utilities schedule disruptions of power. So they literally shut off power to areas that are prone to wildfires so as not to further advance the fire, but also to protect their liability. So you get somebody that may require a ventilator or may require some type of electrically controlled medical device. They're really kind of out on their own. And so that's why the state, like in California, that SGIP program, and places throughout the nation have really created opportunities to deploy energy storage. So that individual home becomes kind of a self-contained power grid to provide that resiliency. The unique idea about a microgrid, and I guess kind of our unique approach, is we patented what's been coined the fractal grid that's been in operation at Camp Pendleton since 2011. And it's essentially a grid of grids. And our approach to digital currency is very much the same. By committing a large power purchase agreement, working with those regional utilities, then adding resiliency, we help to provide a shock absorber on the grid. So in instances like you're talking, when there's over or excessive demand, there are programs called automatic demand response that the utility can send a signal and say, Mike, there's huge demand, and in order to give everybody power, because you've agreed for financial incentive to allow us to take some of your power, we're going to curtail that power and reallocate it elsewhere. So demand response is something that creates resiliency, but it also creates a profit center for Mike's business, hypothetically. And so CleanSpark actually also owns that, owns a communications protocol that allows the utility to send the signal to the facility that we're going to take some of that power away and redistribute it. So we work in conjunction with the utility to act as a shock absorber on the grid, but additionally we work to provide that resiliency for the end user. So much like digital currency is a decentralized approach of currency management or store of value or transaction or whatever the case may be, energy can and is very much the same. The ability to isolate that to provide regionalized or localized pockets of resilient power is going to take the pressure off of the grid and provide greater resiliency. I mean, we hear all about the infrastructure, how aging our country is.
What do you think about that? Do you think that we're making this? Well, in my head, I have this sort of vision. I'm curious if this is how you align on it, where we're moving from a centralized grid infrastructure where all the power is being created by one central power plant to more decentralized, where energy based on renewables, solar, wind, geothermal, etc., probably are being created all across the grid. And so there's different places that are consuming more, but there's also more places that are producing more. And in that way, the grid is decentralized in its production. If that's true, I would imagine that we have to make this transition. So different regulations would make this easier or harder for this transition to happen. Do you feel like we're collectively making this transition efficiently? Or I often wonder a lot about regulations in the utility energy space, because it's debatable. You know, it's not obvious what the implications are, what the second order implications are of some of these regulations on, you have to buy back the energy, you have to disclose your pricing. The negative repercussion of that would be, hey, the power plant is afraid to get sued, the utility company is afraid to get sued, so they're just going to shut down power. And that may not be what we wanted to have happen. So I'm curious your reaction to that.
Well, it's interesting because public policy has been dictated by the utilities for a long time. They've got the deep pockets, and it's interesting. The utilities claim is, well, we built the infrastructure, so when policy dictates that we have to buy solar, our investment in the infrastructure is really the risk that we have. But when you think about it, when you build a building or a house or a facility, you pay to bring the power into your facility. You pay for all that, and then when you add solar, you own that. So I think that there's a disconnect there from a standpoint of public policy. And so you get states like Nevada, the sunniest state in the nation, and NV Energy petitions and lobbies for devaluation of solar, meaning that if I build a big facility, the maximum value I can ever get is zero on my power bill, meaning if I overbuild my solar, I could potentially zero out my power bill. But even if I produce infinitely more than I consume, there's no financial benefit. So why do it? And so it really disincentivizes that, which is where that FERC 2222 comes into play, because it says to the utilities, and this becomes a federal policy, if there is 1 megawatt, which is a significant amount of power, then that 1 megawatt needs to be treated the same as any other electric wholesaler. So the unique component of what FERC 2222 says, as a single producer of energy or as an aggregate. So you get a campus or a industrial complex or even a community that works on a community scale microgrid, and it enables that participation in these federal programs. So you get a new development. This incentivizes a developer to put in microgrids on a new subdivision that has energy storage, has resiliency, and now rather than paying into an HOA, the HOA gets the benefit of selling power back to the grid, and it's incentivized to do that type of stuff because of those public policies. On the opposite side of the equation, you've got the utilities that are manipulating the time of use charges to maximize the profitability for their shareholders, and then also, preemptively shutting down power in times of emergency to protect against potential liability from, lawsuits. So you're exactly right. In fact, years ago, Nightline used to be hosted by a guy named Ted Koppel, and he wrote a book in 2015 or 2016 called Lights Out. And he theorizes that the biggest weakness we have as a nation is our power, our utility infrastructure. And he commented that there are 9 points of critical intersection on the domestic power grid. And if all 9 of those points were simultaneously attacked, so a cyber attack, a physical attack, an EMP attack, whatever that case may be, that there would be parts of our nation without power for up to 2 years. and he discusses a timeline of this long until the grocery stores are out of power. And everybody's like, well, it's no big deal. It's a backup diesel generator. Well, the diesel that goes into that generator comes from a refinery that runs on power. So he kind of builds that whole narrative. And the thesis is that we need to do something about the infrastructure because it's a huge vulnerability and weakness. And so to be proactive, and, we worked with a lot of commercial and industrial clients that make a decision to deploy microgrids and distributed energy decentralized for financial benefit, but then the utilities the federal policy incentivizes them to participate in these programs. So, it may mean tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional revenue for a large facility to participate in a demand response program that really protects that kind of shock absorber on the grid. So it's steps that need to be taken. I think that the challenge that we're faced with is from the infrastructure standpoint, a lot of the input isn't from disinterested participants. So you've got the utility companies that are really at work behind the scenes to ensure preservation of profitability ahead of what's the best for the resiliency of the grid and what they call power security for all of the consumers.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing you said that was really interesting that got me thinking is when the utility company is forced to buy back the power that's created by individual producers, say on a microgrid or whoever has solar, that the reason you needed a federal law to sort of trump the state laws is that the utility company would not want to buy back. They would say, we don't want you even contributing to our grid. We want to be the only producer of energy on the grid, and therefore, we just make more money in that case. I'm wondering, is the problem that could be best solved with blockchain and decentralization of cryptocurrency? Specifically, is the problem that it's difficult for people who create power on the grid to get paid for that power? Because in the case now, the money has to come from the utility company. So when I produce, I have a solar panel on my roof, I'm producing power. The check in the mail is coming from the utility company. So is it true that the solution here is moving from an analog system where there's one central payer, the utility company, to moving to where the grid is paying me? It's like it's if I'm producing this much energy on the grid, well, the decentralization of the ledger recognizes me as a node in the network and therefore sends me, X amount of crypto currency. There's actually, tell me if that makes sense. To start.
You actually you're spot on, Mike. The Department of Energy has sponsored a challenge that's hosted at Stanford University. It's called the TE Challenge, and TE is Transactive Energy. And the idea is that if there are multiple different energy consumers and producers that are geographically similar, when one has time of demand, it doesn't always coincide with the others. So the ability to transact energy back and forth hundreds or even thousands of times a day based on demand, cost avoidance, and increase of efficiency has to be ledgered. Well, how are you going to ledger that transaction? You're going to use the blockchain. So CleanSpark actually prevailed. Our white paper prevailed in the 2015 TE Challenge about our approach to that very solution. And you're exactly right. But beyond just the record keeping and ledgering of those transactions through the utilization of the blockchain, because Bitcoin mining and other digital currency mining is so profitable right now, there's this race. They talk about the arms race and buying the maximum number of mining machines and having the best access to power. So as difficulty increases in Bitcoin mining, it obviously takes more energy to mine each Bitcoin. As pressure comes from multiple different concerns, whether it's Elon Musk sending a tweet or different public utility commissions. Like, for example, I know you're in Oregon. In the state of Washington, there are surpluses or there are penalties if you're mining digital currency with specific energy profiles there's 100% tariff that comes into play. So you're looking to maximize the value of energy, to maximize the energy mix. So nuclear is really big. We're located in Georgia because there's abundant nuclear power. There are new nuclear facilities coming online. They're the 7th most friendly solar state in the nation from a utility scale. And they're proactive. We work with public utility commissions. The chairperson of public policy in the state of Georgia is actively involved with companies like CleanSpark in creating opportunities for us to commit to bigger power purchase agreements in exchange for their agreement to seek cleaner energy sources. So now not only are we looking to create these behind the meter transactions that you discussed with, this transactive energy and blockchain technology, but now blockchain companies, Bitcoin companies are leading the charge in creating new investment opportunities for these renewables. Because at the end of the day, everything comes down to energy on these, regardless of which digital currency you're a fan of, it really all comes down to the most appropriate power management and usage.
So when you say that the Bitcoin miners are driving the adoption of the, say, solar technology, that means that the most efficient use of that solar technology is for Bitcoin mining, that they're getting the most out of it. So they're driving, they're all competing. The Bitcoin miners are competing to purchase the solar energy because their use of the energy is more profitable. Is that the right way to think about it?
So that's definitely one way to think about it. I think maybe another way to look at it is if I'm the utility and I have a coal-fired power plant or a nat gas facility and I'm making reasonable margins and I can serve the load in my entire community, what incentive do I have to make additional investments in renewables? Enter a digital currency miner that may buy 20 or 50 or 100 megawatts of power. It's now creating additional demand for power, and rather than bringing on more antiquated non-renewable technology, the solution is to deploy additional renewables because it just makes sense. We've reached the point that the cost of solar panels has dropped sufficiently that it's actually more efficient to build a solar farm than it is to build a coal-fired power plant. And that's the first time that this has happened. So by committing to these larger power purchase agreements and working collectively with the utility, it actually benefits the entire communities and the surrounding areas by overbuilding the systems and creating that power security. So, more than 100 people lost their lives in Texas because of ice storms, because wind turbines freeze. And the system isn't, it's so centralized. In Texas, they have an ERCOT system, so you can kind of pick your power. The problem is that gives you protection against, you can seek the lowest rate, but there's no cap. So there were instances of people having thousands of dollars in electrical charges for a day because the demand charges went so high during these massive outages. So by decentralizing that and creating that resiliency, you create safety and energy certainty for the community at large. And there really isn't another enterprise that can pay for such large quantities of power that really is their core business. I mean, we're not making widgets. We're minting digital currency, and our main cost, is energy. We talked publicly today. We actually sold Bitcoin for the first time at a larger scale today. We sold Bitcoin to buy more new efficient mining rigs. Nobody at the large public scale, the institutional type players have really done that before. But when you look at it, Bitcoin's $5,000 a coin to $6,000 a coin for us to mine. Okay, in that range, depending on the number of factors. It's $55,000 to sell. So we go buy $30 million of electrical equipment or of mining equipment today and pay for a significant percentage of that using digital currency. So we've got a 90% margin on the coins that we're selling. that increase our ability to buy clean power, to make larger power commitments to utility, to increase our hash rate and production and support of the blockchain, and create an increase in efficiency by replacing older, less efficient equipment. So we really see that, it's when CleanSpark first jumped into digital currency, people kind of did the head scratcher. It's like, well, you're a microgrid power company. How does this correlate? And when you really look at it through that lens, it's the same. It's all about that decentralization.
Yeah, because you guys are masters of efficient uses of power, and Bitcoin mining it would seem to me like the power is more important than the server technology. I mean, certainly you have to have the right rigs, and increasingly so the people who have more sophisticated, specialized rigs for mining have an advantage from people who are mining on their laptops. But are those rigs a commodity now, or are you buying them from a couple of suppliers, or what's the state of the Bitcoin mining rigs nowadays? So
there are 2 or 3 well-known manufacturers. I think the leader right now, there are advocates for, when you're talking about ASICs, there are advocates for multiple different, whether it's, the WhatsMiner is more efficient, it's noisier, it's louder, but the S19 is more predictable. And so it's kind of the debate, what truck is better, Ford or Chevrolet? I mean, it's just a matter of preference. Our SVP of data center operations is a Brazilian guy by the name of Bernardo Schuchman. And Bernardo has been involved in Bitcoin for a decade. And when we acquired his facility, we had an audit done by BDO. And over Bernardo's career, BDO certified that he had mined in excess of 50,000 Bitcoin. So here's a guy that kind of has seen the ebb and flow and the ins and outs, the development and growth of the technology. And so we've focused our growth around the S19s from Bitmain. They're consistent, and it's kind of, I hate to use a bunch of analogies, but Southwest Airlines says they'll fly any plane as long as it's a 737. It's kind of the same thing, because the redundancy in controls and interconnection, maintenance, repairs, it just makes it simple. So we have a multitude of different providers. It is more efficient at scale than GPU mining. Our preference and our deployments recently, we talked about the fact that we have 23,500 plus S19s that are scheduled for delivery in the coming months.
Wait, it's 23,000. And how big is each unit?
Each unit is about 18 inches by 8 by 8. They're not very big. And we've taken a kind of a unique approach. So you asked in the beginning of our conversation about the technology for cooling. So we bought 2 data centers. So we have one in College Park, Georgia. It's about 50,000 square feet. It was primarily a traditional data center, did management for police and fire, body camera, medical records, the Atlanta airport. And as it's kind of phased away from traditional data center, they started to implement mining as a service. So guys like us could go buy a few ASICs, put them on the shelf there. We'd pay for power, and then we get a 75-25 split on the Bitcoin that we generate. That's how a lot of our competitors approach this. There are companies that are in this space that don't own their own facilities. They just buy miners and place them. We've taken a different approach in that we own our facilities, but then we maximize the efficiency. So inside a data center, you have these massive chillers and air handlers and the elevated floors. What we've learned is that you can decrease the parasitic costs, the costs that result in anything other than digital currency mining, by using higher volume non-chilled air, even in a place like Atlanta. So we've built mobile mining centers that are self-contained, that we've placed on our facility. So we've got a 50,000 square foot facility and an 80,000 square foot facility, and we use those as data centers. We have traditional data center operations. We're rebuilding or redesigning them to make them more efficient for digital currency mining when it comes to cooling. but we're deploying as we speak 30 megawatts of power in College Park, Georgia, mostly nuclear, in mobile mining rigs on the facility that comprises our data centers. So now we've got mobile rigs that use high volumes of just ambient air rather than big chillers or liquid cool. And based on volume, we can manage the temperatures efficiently without the big parasitic load, wasted energy going to the chillers and the cooling and all of that stuff. So we're constantly identifying ways to maximize the efficiency and then decrease the exposure to grid disruptions by putting microgrids that actually enable us to bridge the gap in the event of a disruption. I mean, a company like CleanSpark that we last publicly talked about our hash rate about a month and a half ago, and we said that we were in excess of 1 exahash. If you're 1 exahash, and for the sake of round numbers, let's say you're mining 7 or 8 Bitcoin a day, if you have a disruption, and that disruption is for a minute or two, and those mining rigs disconnect from the pool that you're contributing to, and you're now disconnected from the blockchain, just like unplugging and plugging your computer back in, by the time everything reconnects and boots back up, you've lost maybe an hour of processing time. And when you're talking about those volumes, that's kind of a big deal. So by using that technology, we kind of bridge those gaps to create that a resiliency or redundancy, so that in the event of disruptions that happen, random times per day, we have the ability to kind of withstand that, provide energy storage to provide for short-term energy management, but then to increase the efficiency by managing the time of use and the addition of renewables, et cetera, to make it even more efficient at a localized level versus just the utility participation.
Yeah. And to get a sense of what other people are doing, I'd imagine this is top of mind for other large Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency miners, where they're thinking about uptime or minimizing downtime, cooling, efficient uses of energy, efficient suppliers of energy, rates of energy, and then efficient machines to do the Bitcoin mining. Are there structural differences in how, are we kind of racing to this point where you're going to buy as many machines as possible, as quick as possible, for the cheapest energy as possible, and then it's going to converge where you're making, you're mining a Bitcoin at 90,000 and it's producing 100,000, and that's kind of the market. It just kind of caps out there, or do you see this as being repurposed in somehow? I'm trying to get a sense for like the industry of Bitcoin mining at large. It's changed so much since the last time I've really dove into it.
Yeah, it's a really kind of a unique way to think about it. We look at it differently. So a lot of our competitors do co-located facilities, right? So they go buy 100,000 miners, and they're placed with, let's just say, Core Scientific or one of those big co-location facilities. So what happens is the Bitcoin mining company pays the energy cost plus a premium, and then does a revenue share on the digital currency that they mine. Well, the problem is that as difficulty increases, and then in 2024, we're facing another halving, so you get half as much Bitcoin for the same amount of hash rate. Now it squeezes those margins. So while there's currently an arms race to just get as many rigs as you can, I think our thesis is that many of these companies that don't own any facilities are really building the hosting facilities, because they don't have the risk. They have the guaranteed revenue. They're not buying the mining equipment. They don't have that exposure. And effectively those mining rigs become a commodity. There's such price variability based on the current price of Bitcoin. So we've approached it in that we own our own facilities. And then we also do co-location, but it has to be the right partner. So we talked about that we have a 20 or 25 megawatt agreement with CoinMint in Messina, New York. So CoinMint is a decommissioned Alcoa aluminum facility, and it's got hydroelectric on site. It's been around for 80 or 100 years, and they're 94% carbon free. So we have a unique arrangement with CoinMint in that not only are we hosting a tremendous amount of miners there at extremely competitive rates on a 94% carbon-free power mix, but we're also working with CoinMint to deploy microgrid solutions to take that to carbon neutral. So it's a proactive approach. And, it's interesting. Earlier this year, my colleague, Zach Bradford, spoke on a panel about digital currency mining. And there was a lot of stuff in the media about, greenage using the natural gas power plants in New York. And there was a report that it was raising the temperature of the lake that they use the water for cooling. And there are other companies that, for example, I think Marathon worked with Beowulf in decommissioning a 100 megawatt coal-fired power plant in Montana. And the approach was just like you said, brute force, get as many machines as cheap a power as you can. But then there's a pivot, and in the current administration, and I think with the current concerns from an environmental perspective, it's no longer okay to say, well, we're only changing the temperature of a river by so much, or we're only adding so many thousand tons of carbons to the atmosphere. It's no longer acceptable. So to have been proactive, Zach made a comment on there about if we don't self-govern and self-regulate, we're going to be regulated from the outside. And that really is the antithesis of what a decentralized currency is all about. And it was interesting that on that call, some of those other players kind of panned that approach and said, our job is to maximize the return for our shareholders. I think that what was lost in the translation is those are not separate. You can maximize the return to the shareholders while being a better environmental steward and creating a more friendly environment that increases the adoption of digital currencies, as opposed to being a dirty solution that, Jamie Dimon said yesterday, Bitcoin has no value. It's worthless. And that thesis comes from the stuff you see on the news that, it's really dirty. It's not that efficient. I'll just use my Visa card, without understanding the real, and I don't mean to imply that Jamie Dimon doesn't understand finance, but, it's kind of an interesting approach.
I don't know. I mean, if you make that kind of comment, there's only two potential realities. One is he doesn't understand the potential in Bitcoin. Two is that he does, and he's incentivized to lie. And I think it's probably the latter. Like, you probably want to hold on to this franchise you built. Chase is super valuable, and they're significantly threatened by decentralization, DeFi, crypto, and everything else. So, I mean, his comment makes sense. So can't knock him there, but it's not true.
No, it's
and it's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time.
It's interesting. My mom is 75 years old, and she watches CNBC, and so she asked me, so are you afraid? I mean, you guys mine Bitcoin, and this is a guy that says it's not worth anything. And I guess my response, just simplifying the conversation, pull a $10 bill out of your wallet. I mean, that's worth $10 because you and I agree. It's not actually worth $10. There's no longer gold in a reserve backing the currency. And the more $3 billion or $3 trillion or $4 trillion in stimulus continues to devalue that and devalue currency and put additional pressure. So I think our argument, and probably not dissimilar from yours, is that the finite nature of Bitcoin is in fact what does create that value. And had it not been transacted to buy pizzas all those years ago, it'd be worthless. But now it's a recognized store.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's worth something.
And the reason why people pick recognized stores of value is based on the properties of them. I mean, gold is a resource that wasn't easily duplicatable. It was identifiable. It wouldn't erode. I mean, the reason why gold was picked was because of a certain set of properties about it. And I think that that's what's so exciting about Bitcoin is people recognize the properties in Bitcoin that we care about with store of value make more sense than gold. And you don't have to overthink it to realize that. That's where I'm like, Jamie Dimon, what are you talking about? I don't know if we'll a little bit of a circle back, but looking at the future, if you kind of project maybe 10 years plus out, do you think it looks like the centralized utility companies, the people who are producing power on the energy grid, they're significantly reduced. And we have people that have solar panels on the roofs. There's a lot more people producing. And then do you see it as one blockchain or one cryptocurrency emerging as the sort of energy coin? And there probably is already something out there that does this, but is there one sort of dominant currency that may be recognized by the government or enforced by the government that people have to use? We're all trading for it, and I can't imagine that's Bitcoin, because the properties of Bitcoin don't make for really effective, cheap, fast, short transfers. But do you see that as kind of taking hold? I'm curious.
That's an interesting question. So I definitely see the decentralization of energy. Rather than looking at a map of the U.S. and seeing hotspots where there are generation facilities and distribution facilities and transmission facilities and ultimately end users, we believe that everyone, every building, every apartment complex, every campus, every home will become a prosumer. So you produce and you consume. There are different times. Some people work at nights and some people work during the day. The balance of that ultimately will balance out in the system, because the time of use charges vary. So energy can be stored for use when there's times of additional demand, but it's going to focus on creating resiliency. Now, with regards to whether or not there's an energy coin, I think that's a great question, and I don't know that we've really given it a ton of consideration. I would say probably definitely not going to be Bitcoin, with the idea of government mandated and government controlled. But they talk about the USDT and all of those kind of centralized US dollar based tokens. But we're big proponents of what it means to support the Bitcoin blockchain and how that continues to grow, and that it really drives resiliency and efficiency. So we think it's a big paradigm shift in electricity, because it stimulates generation and incentivizes the construction of these renewables. So we see it as a real shift that benefits the planet.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the news often gets this so wrong, where they look at Bitcoin as a massive energy consumer in the same way that, your average house in the corner would be. But of course it's not, because it's not consuming energy in the same format. I mean, I think of the energy consumption of Bitcoin rigs as being just more efficient, because people like you are spending your time thinking about where can I find the most efficient use of energy. There was a guy I talked to who was building these Bitcoin mining rigs that would connect to natural gas outlets. So in Texas, apparently there is an enormous, I've heard it's somebody else in this podcast was telling me that it's the amount of energy that Japan uses is how much energy is wasted in Texas from natural gas spill-offs. And it's like, the reason for that is it costs money to get a truck all the way down to this rig, put it on, and then get the truck out. And sometimes it doesn't make economic sense to do that, so they just burn the gas. And He says, okay, I'm going to stick a rig on there and then connect to the internet, and voila, you have an efficient use of that energy as opposed to burning it. And it makes a lot of sense. And I think there's probably more examples of that. One thing I wonder, maybe this is the last question, but I had dinner with a guy once who's telling me that he ran in California a solar power plant. So he would, and this to me makes sense, and I'm curious what your reaction is to this. He said, if you have a solar power plant, you put it in the middle of the desert. One, the land is super cheap. Two, you have high sun access, is really sunny all the time. And then three, you have the benefits of the consolidation of the technology of the solar panel. So you could have robots go down, they replace one, they put them on, as opposed to when you stick solar panels on top of roofs, you have to hire people, they have to come out, they have to have insurance, they have to, it costs a lot of money to install every panel on top of everyone's houses. And so I'm like, well, why wouldn't it look like we have a few massive, huge flower looking, solar power plants in the middle of the desert, and that just sends energy out to the grid. I don't know if there's any obvious flaw in that thinking, but I wanted to throw that out to you.
So when you go between Utah and California, you drive through that corner in Nevada, there's massive solar fields out there. And I was reading a story about how that particular field, and the name escapes me right now, but how the efficiency was less than they expected it to be when it was designed. And the conclusion was that they didn't factor in the loss of sunlight due to contrails from commercial airliners, that the vapor trail was enough to decrease that. And it's just, kind of an, whatever, just for your GWiz file. The challenge to that is that you still have transmission and distribution. So you still have areas of vulnerability. So the idea of creating decentralization, so you still have that, obviously serving what they call baseload power. And that makes a ton of sense. And as energy storage comes down, it makes even more sense, because you can overcharge during the day, create enough overbuild, so you create the daytime supply, but then store that surplus power for use when the sun isn't shining. So that's a really unique approach. And to your first point, flare gas is a huge problem. We were working with the University of Wyoming and a couple of engineers, and there's waste coal. So coal mining has been a big deal in our country for decades, and there are waste coal, what they call coal fines, all over the place that are on the surface of the ground because it's not efficient, just like flare gas. So you drill an oil well, you do your seismic analysis, and you see a structure or a stratigraphic trap, and you're going to produce oil, and unbeknownst to you, there's enough gas in there to flare, but not enough to bring a pipeline out, and it doesn't have the energy density and value to truck it, so you flare it off. So if I put a Bitcoin mine, a mobile facility, and a turbine using flare gas and creating that energy, from an environmental perspective, it's non-renewable energy. If I use those coal fines and that waste coal that has to be reclaimed anyway, where's it going to go? And what better way to incentivize that cleanup than to utilize it to generate currency? And so, we've worked with different universities, as I said, the University of Wyoming, to use our gasification technology to process that. And the problem that you have is, because you're burning a hydrocarbon, it's still deemed to be dirty power. So I think we've got to get to that tipping point that we see that there's this huge waste of flare gas. Municipal waste is a potential energy source. Waste coal is an energy source. We could be a lot more proactive, and Bitcoin, digital currency mining, may very well be the kind of the impetus to make all that stuff happen.
Yeah. These are such important conversations for everyone, because oftentimes these debates, whether the government should enact a policy that incentivizes, faster adoption of some sustainable energy solution, solar panels or geothermal or energy storage, whatever it is. Sometimes you can go too fast. You can enact policies that that waste money. They waste tax dollars, are incentivizing people to buy Teslas before the market is really there. And there's kind of a natural adoption curve as the problem exists. People build solutions, and I often wonder whether we need government incentives to push us faster, or if just naturally there's so much interest collectively and there's so much incentive to move towards sustainables that, any acceleration there is just kind of wasted energy, so to speak. But either way, these are things that show up on the ballot. That living in California, there's propositions on the ballots that go out to voters. And it's like, oftentimes this is the first time a voter has ever even thought of these things. And the way that they phrase the questions are so biased, that you don't know, and they're so complicated that they're steering people towards answering in certain ways. So I almost view it as like, collectively, we have to decentralize intelligence of how the grid works in order to allow it to grow efficiently. So anyways, long-winded way of saying thank you for coming on, Matt. I really enjoyed the conversation and I learned a ton. So are you available on social media anywhere, or do you publish your thoughts anywhere as well?
Yep, I do. So CleanSpark has its own social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I have my personal Instagram that I, when I go through one of our facilities, I post videos. It's
cool.
Just S Matthew Schultz. But I also handle all of our corporate communications and investor relations for CleanSpark. So on our website, our investor relations contact comes directly to me, both phone or email. So, I'm passionate about this. It's something I believe in. I'm a father of 6. So I think being a good steward of the planet is important. So, love to talk about it further, with anybody that may have interest. And I appreciate having the opportunity to come chat with you. And I'd sure love to come back at some point.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.